The shutdown may have some marginal effect. I'm still of the view it's probably more weather and seasonal issues. As Steve knows, he wrote the piece, I think, a couple of years ago, highlighting the fact the government can't seem to get Q1 correct. And now with weather supposedly going to be super cold in the Midwest, where there's a lot of transportation and distribution lanes for manufacturing, that weather cold, that's probably a bigger factor than the government shutdown, personally.
That's exactly what I was going to say. So you actually think the bigger risk to a weak first quarter GDP, the bigger risk is the cold snap than the
cold snap
shutdown.
and the seasonality, the fact the government can't seem to get the data accurate because you typically get a big rebound in Q2.
But my point is right now they're not getting the data out at all.
Right, they're not.
So we didn't have the retail sales, we didn't have durable goods. You know, a lot of it we've had to rely on the manufacturing surveys where people say, what are your plans? How do you feel about things? As opposed to getting the hard data yet.
It's true, but I tend to like the softer data more just because the hard data, while it looks good when you go back and look at the figures, you got to keep in mind, Kelly, these numbers are revised. You could drive a truck through the first and final estimate of GDP. So sentiment to me is important, and sentiment is what responds to markets. And I would argue markets now are more important in driving monetary policy than they've ever been before.
Well, what about the old, was it Paul Samuelson, the line that markets have called the 9 of the last 5 recessions? So yes, they're probably one of the best, you know, real-time indicators
they're better than economists.
They're probably even better than economists.
Better than economists.
But they're not perfect.
No,
I'm not sure that's right, that they're better than economists. And I also disagree with Joe a little bit on the issue of the data, which is he's right that the data is revised. But if you think about that, it means not only do we have to wait longer for the first print, now we've got to wait longer for the revision, which means that you're, you know, I guess the definition of flying blind here in a lot of different ways, especially at a critical turning point. I don't know, Joe, that there's been any studies that show the soft data does a better job than the hard data in not only telling us what's going to happen, but even telling us what's happening right now.
Yeah, I mean,
I think it's all, you use it all together.
Although, absolutely, but I just knowing, working with data, I find that a lot of series are lagging to coincident. They're not forward-looking. And the reason I think sentiment is just more important is that QE and forward guidance have worked through asset price channels. And when asset markets move, whether it's credit or equities, that tends to impact sentiment. And therefore, sentiment, I would argue, becomes effectively a leading indicator.
You also brought a sort of data point we can look at when we're talking about why might this slowdown be happening. And with the Fed meeting coming up this week, you know, how much more should they be tightening? Is pausing the right thing to do here? Well, you know, yes, we're still low. I mean, the interest rates are low historically speaking, but if you look at this chart, it would suggest we've actually had more tightening overall than in any of the last 3 or 4, really going back to the Volcker days.
Right. Now, so just to be clear on this chart, this shows the shadow rate. So the Wu-Ji had a shadow rate they used effectively back during the early QE years and said that rates effectively were about minus 300 basis points.
Yeah,
so
like
that's
minus
how you
2.5%.
That's how you get such a large cumulative increase. And I'm not saying this is exactly the right way to look at monetary policy, but it does suggest perhaps one channel by which the Fed has tightened more than what many people believe.
Does this use some factor for the balance sheet reduction?
No. So I added, so we did a balance sheet calculation and found, Steve, the balance sheet maybe was worth an extra 50 basis points.
Wow.
Having said that, the weakness in housing and autos, I would say, is broadly consistent with this sort of narrative.